we talk about fixing knee pain and kind of discussing what knee pain is. And so we call these barefoot workshops. I think it's a little bit more fun, but that is because we'll be able to work on some of the stuff afterwards. So any questions you have, I'll kind of walk you through some exercises and things like that afterwards. So I'm going to do a better job of keeping myself brief on the front end with this, as opposed to letting myself linger linguistically. I'm going to try and summarize this with grace and poise, so I don't talk too long. All right, so big talking points. Understanding the pressure. So we're going to talk about the fascial suit and the context within which your knees exist. The three most common knee problems. I'm not going to tell you now, but I'll tell you what they are. Long and short range training, basically a protocol we'll use to start to remodel and connect and pull apart this connective tissue. The dichotomy between stiffness and mobility, which is a big thing because that ultimately is what creates the spectrum upon which your knee mobility happens. And then we have the question about surgery, screens, and scans, which will be a little bit more of an open-ended discussion because that's a less direct answer, so to speak. All right, so when we look at understanding the pressure, the biggest, best thing I could introduce you to, if you haven't already heard me talk at length about this, is the concept of fascia and your fascial suit. So you have one piece of skin that wraps around your entire body. Underneath that skin, you have these corollary layers of fascia. Now, fascia is this connective tissue. Basically, it's a mixture of collagen, fibers, elastin proteins, extracellular matrix, which is kind of like threaded. If you think of like the cellulose of a plant wall, that's kind of the version of that for the humans. And then within that, there's fluid that's trapped within those layers that creates this kind of a stretchy, long, viscoelastic tissue. And that wraps around and in and through every part of your body. So it goes all the way from the microscopic level up to the macro level, where you can see these big fascial stretches, like your IT band, for example, is a long stretch of fascia. And so it wraps around your individual muscle fibers, it wraps around groups of fibers, it wraps around muscle bellies, it wraps around ligaments. It is interspersed and threaded through to become tendons that attach to bones. Bones are encased in this, organs are wrapped around this, nerves are in this. So if at any point you were to cut your body open, you would see tubes. So basically the vessels, the muscle cells, the nerve tissue, the organs, you see tubes that are wrapped inside of fascia, and then that continues to be bigger tubes and the bigger tubes. And it's all wrapped and suspended in this messy spiderweb-like matrix of tissue that surrounds your body. Now, this creates the foundation for something called tensegrity, or not, biotensegrity is probably more accurate, but the traditional view we look at the body is through the compressive lens. So compression relies on gravity to hold things down, meaning if you took the Colosseum to space, it would fall apart. It would float away because it doesn't have gravity to press down. Now, obviously, there are some things like the stones have melted into one another, and sometimes we'll have adhesive and glue and things like that to kind of hold big pieces together. But that's, if we had a perfectly flat surface and gravity was pressing down, like a house of cards is a compression structure. But any lateral shearing force will knock it over, any wind, any twisting, all that stuff. So that's where if you were to take a house of cards and glue it together, you would have, you would have to make up for that lack of tensional integrity in the system by adding in some type of adhesive. Tensegrity, however, is a relationship of pushing and pulling, which is attraction and repulsion that happens all the way at the atomic level to create molecules, and at the systemic level between bones and fascial tissue to create a whole. So it's something that we started to conceptualize in the 1940s and 60s, first through artwork, then through studying of material sciences as we started to explore better ways to peer into the body, looking through surgeons, doctors that would look at the cellular level all the way up to the surgical level and just see different things and try to understand how the body works. And so that's important because if you think about all the tissue at the knee, specifically between the joints, so the femur, that, your thigh bone that runs and connects with the tibia, which is your shin bone, it's really just two plateaus that sit on top of one another. And there's a bunch of stuff of soft tissue in there, your menisci, your ACL, PCL, MCL, LCL. And then you get tendons all wrapped in the synovial fluid, and there's articulating cartilage. The question should be, well, how does this stuff not smash everything up? So if you think of a mortar and pestle, that's the exact thing. In a sense, your tibia, your fibula, sorry, not fibula, your femur is like a mortar. And well, actually, I don't know which one is the mortar and which one is the pestle. Whatever the rod looking thing, that's your femur, and then the pestle would be the bottom. And so that grinds things down. So in the compressor structure, where everything is pressing into one another, the spinal vertebrae are sitting on top of discs that are sitting on top of a pelvic bowl that sits on top of your femur, that sits on top of your knee, all that would press into one another. And so there's certain things that the compression model doesn't explain. That's where the biointegrity model holds the body as a system that creates space between it creates space where there is decompression, so to speak. So that's how your organs don't just collapse to your pelvic floor. It's how your lung can create space to pull in oxygen. It's how the soft tissue between your knees doesn't get smashed. In essence, bones are not touching bones. Bones are floating in a web of connective tissue. And that's pockets of muscle that are dispersed within fascial lines. And so on the right, you see these blue long stretches. Those are 3 of 12 as one way of organizing them, fascial lines. And these fascial lines, you can think of like interstate highways that run across the country. They connect major cities. In the body, these major cities are like muscles. So you have your quadriceps, your calves, your you know obliques, your biceps, whatever the muscles are. But along this stretch, you have a connective stretch of tissue that runs from an anchor point to another anchor point, and within that there are pockets of muscles. So these pockets of muscles are the way we consciously connect to our body. They are things that move that basically the tissue, the vacuum of this. If you think about a bone that needs to bend too much starts to disperse, and well, it works the other way around, where there's a vacuum, and so the pressure and pull creates a stimulus that creates a hardening in a bone that resists the pulling of tension. So the pulling creates a resistance. So a bone spur, for example, is the growth of new bone in response to the excessive pulling of tension. So you start to see the tension happens, and then in relationship to a push back, the pull creates a harder push, and that push firms tissue. So collagen fiber eventually becomes calcified, turns into bones, and these bones start to develop and fill vacuums, and those vacuums then create space that then create greater leverage for more pulling, and that starts to differentiate into different sets of tissues that can exist within this. And it is, the body literally goes from this like one little egg cell to this like expanding set of tissue that continues to diversify and expand and grow into this system we have as a body. And so the broad picture of that is that these fascial lines connect stretches of tissue, and the muscles are a conscious way we connect to that to disperse force. So when you jump, run, land, throw, sprint, carry, crawl, you name it, muscles are working to absorb consciously that, and they disperse force through fascial. It's a what do you call it? When a decentralized way of spreading out force so that it doesn't go into our passive tissue. By passive tissue, I mean bones, soft tissue between the joints, so like cartilage. The things that really aren't meant to load well, they're good for leverage and support, but they're not necessarily meant to directly absorb force, compared to something like an active pliable tissue like a muscle or a ligament, or not a ligament, a tendon, or any of the connective tissue that becomes the fascia. So in that concept, what you want to think about is you have a straight jacket onesie. So this is the best way to kind of conceptualize this. Imagine you're wearing like a onesie pajamas. Have you ever seen a Christmas Story? Little Ralphie gets that pink, bunny suit from the aunt. And hey, Roy, stop chewing stuff. There's dog sitting, and he's over there eating plastic. All right, I don't think he's eating plastic, but hopefully he's not. So anyways, I'm not letting my dog that I'm watching eating plastic, because that would be bad, but just all right. Anyways, for posterity, when you watch this, you don't think I'm a bad dog sitter. Anyways, don't hire me to be a rover unless you want your dog to lose weight, because we're going on lots of runs. All right, but the point is, straight jacket onesie. You imagine you're wearing this suit, so to speak, and now instead of just thinking about it as a static thing, think about it more as a dynamic suit that responds to your movement. So when you move, it becomes more pliable, it stretches out, you get some tissue, and it feels good and nice and open. So When you don't move, it starts to stiffen and shrink. And so it becomes more like a straitjacket that prevents your movement. So, in response to movement, our straitjacket onesie, which is another way of thinking of your fascial suit, starts to become more pliable and open up. And that's good because it creates space. When we don't move, it starts to compress and squeeze down and becomes more of a like a Chinese finger trap, so to speak, that where we are getting locked and stuck into a set of positions. Naturally, areas that should move in the body, we want to continue to move. Areas that we don't want to move, like the IT band or certain areas along heavy stretches, meaning they shouldn't have a lot of flexion, they might be able to stretch, those are going to get stiffer. So it's a natural mechanism that stiffens areas that shouldn't move, but it stiffens everything because everything is constantly remodeling to stimulus. And if you're not moving it, your body assumes, well, we don't need to move. But if you should be moving it, that's where you create problems. And so the question isn't where is the pain? The question is, where is the pressure? Now, if you think about your body in this straitjacket onesie, when you lose movement, you will feel that first at the joints, meaning the joints are the thing that bend. So those will be the tip of the spear, so to speak, that poke into a stiffening of this tissue. And when you move the knee, rarely are you moving the knee in any functional capacity without also moving the hip and the ankle. So it's not as though you can just straighten the knee and bend the knee. You will end up bending and pulling at the knee and or the hip and the ankle, which then create a set of tension that exacerbate the pressure at the knee. So if I've bent the ankle, I'm going to have a stretching on the back of the knee from the Achilles and the calf that wrap around the bottom of the heel. I'm also going to have a stretching at the top of the knee and the front of the knee from the hip that's flexing and pulling down. So you see somewhat of a negation of any one specific area because all three are bending, unless you have a stiff ankle or a stiff hip or a stiff knee. That creates a pressure that so another way of saying this is the ankle and the knee and the hip will bend, and the pressuring, the bending of one is countered by the flexing of the other, unless you start to have stiffness at any one joint. And so that stiffness creates a excess pull that then it heightens the pressure and the compression you feel at the joint. That is what starts to lock down and squeeze in the end. So the important thing is to realize it's not just a knee problem. Everything in your body is connected. So you have to start to think about your knee as the awkward middle child of your foot and your hip. So I always say that the knee goes where the foot takes it and does what the hip allows. So if you have little to no hip rotation, internal or external, the knee won't be able to, the knee will have to compensate for that. And if your foot starts to get pulled in or out, or it's really stiff, and so you start to have to, if it's stiff and you can't absorb force, then the knee has to deal with that torque. But the foot, if it pronates in, the knee's going to go in. If it or supinates out, the knee's going to go out. And so you start to see that the foot will take it in one position. So if we're not conscious of our feet and how we're landing and moving, and we don't have the supple mobility of the 28 bones at the foot and the in that ankle complex, so we don't have that capacity to absorb and dynamically shift to optimize where we're going to put our force, the knee gets carried along with that. And you can see how the torque, which is this angular acceleration, so the force of basically you're moving, you have a lever that is being pushed at a way that is perpendicular to gravity relative, that is fixed at a point. So you have a lever that's fixed at a point, and then gravity is pushing down at an end. That creates an angular acceleration that ultimately creates torsion, which is the result of two different forces. So when you squeeze a towel, you're creating torsion. That torque is can amplify rapidly, especially as you get towards a longer lever. So when you get a foot gets fixed in the ground with a cleat, or a hip gets stuck and the knee gets, the foot gets fixed and the hip can't rotate. Well, what you end up with is a situation where that torque creates the torsion at the knee, and that tears ligaments like nothing else. And so you have to be mindful of this is not just a knee problem. The pressure you're feeling at the knee is because of fascial lines that are compressing in due to stiffness or lack of motion elsewhere. Now, you can also have a stiffness at the knee, but in general, if the knee is kind of like the elbow, it doesn't have a lot of independent movement capacity. It just has to deal with the stimuli that goes through it. So, your shoulder can rotate and you can hang, and your hand and your wrist can move, but your elbow really just kind of does where it goes, where your hand takes it, so to speak. So that's what you have to keep in mind, is that if you have knee problems, it's the downstream result of something else. So your job when you have a knee issue is to start to become a detective. And the thing to remember is that the pain is rarely where the problem is. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a problem where the pain is, meaning associated connective tissue or soft tissue that's being worn down. But the real problem is upstream, downstream, or opposite side of the body. So by that, I mean you have to look upstream, which is a joint above, closer to your torso. So you're moving closer to your vital organs. So it could be a hip, it could be a spinal issue, it could be a stiff shoulder, for example. If you can't swing and extend your shoulder, then you can't rotate your spine. That causes a loss of this spinal engine motion that allows the hip and the spine to move in this dance, so to speak. Then that kind of could create a loss of hip rotation that can then feed to stiffness and increased torque at the knee. Or it could be downstream, which is below the knee, so closer away to the ground or further away on the appendages. So bunions, loss of toe movement, loss of toe dexterity, loss of strength and integrity in the foot ankle complex, loss of strength in the actual foot, stiffness in the shin, the calf muscles. All of these things create a stilt underneath you when it should be a very dynamic set of tissues that can absorb things. So those issues create tissues. Those tissue issues create pressure somewhere, and then if you end up, the knee just has a lot of leverage. There's a lot of big muscles that go there, so we tend to feel it. And because we're walking, sitting, squatting, standing, running, jumping, things that end up inevitably using the knee, we end up feeling it there. And so that creates the circumstance, which we'll talk about in the problems, or the most common problems next, but that creates the foundation where you have a compression on a joint, so there's not as much space to move fluidly, and you have a loss of, let's say, you have a compression on the joint, but you have a heightened stiffness of the muscles. There's a loss of connection to the muscles, meaning they can't pliably be strong in full range of motion, meaning they can't disperse force, and you have a compression on the joint. So it's not only are you not dispersing force, so the force is more localized to a certain area, you also have a compression on the joint, which prevents the joint to be able to move to deal with that force. And so the other thing too, and this is kind of nail in the coffin, in my opinion, for the compression view of the body, is that sedentary knees hurt too. So you would think that if it was just compression wearing things down, then you would treat it like the brake pads in a car. If you have a car that sits in a garage and let's just say it's humid and temperature controlled, it might, not have a great engine. It might get, a little rusty, but the brake pads are going to be good. The material science of that is the brake pads wear down. Of course, you can have a degradation of the material based off of certain atmospheric compositions, but let's assume that the material has not worn down from like rust and oxidation. But the material of a brake pad wears down in relation to the physical use it gets. You would think that if you have a knee for someone who's pretty sedentary, worked a desk job, didn't really do that much for the rest of for their whole life, they'd have great knees. They'd have great brake pads on the connective tissue and the cartilage. But that's not what you see, because what happens is everything's related. So stiffness in the body from sitting and not moving continues to squeeze down in your straitjacket onesie, and that causes a degradation of the tissue that's rubbing against one another. So, we'll talk about this in the next piece, but it's not that soft tissue doesn't wear down. It's saying that that's not the ultimate original problem. What we want to understand is that knee injuries and knee pain happens when the knee gets compressed. So it's one other piece on this is, since every bit of tissue in your body is connected through this fascial network, so the fascial tissue that kind of wraps around and surrounds things is like a suction, there's a compression. So there's not like there are vacuums in the body where you have spaces for things to exist, but there cavities in the body, I should say, that you can put organs and soft tissue. But it's not like there's a bunch of open air pockets in that and there's floating around. So there is every bit of space in your body is held by fluid or some type of tissue, or if there is a cavity that's occupied and there is fluid that kind of expands to fill the space. There are some gaseous areas, but if you have gas in your organs, you get bloated, and that's not a confident or fun place to be. But arterial stiffness, stress in your body, blood pressure, certain loss of fascial pliability around the organs. So you've increased visceral fat that hardens and stiffens your core. All of these create increased pressure on the body. And so sitting around being stressed all day, working at the desk job, is going to mean you're not going to have a movement stimulus, and B, you have a heightened stress inside your body, which speeds up your heart rate, increases your blood pressure. If you ever think about what increases your blood pressure, it's stiffness, heightened stiffness in the arterial tissue. So and that stiffness happens when we squeeze that down. So that stiffness is correlated by a pull on, like hardening or constriction of the arterial tissue. It directly relates to the fascial connective tissue that supports it, and that creates a increased pressure on the body. And so that's not even to mention dehydration, poor diets, things like smoking that can rob you of trace minerals that you need to be healthy and pliable. Those things all factor into a stiffening of the tissue that compresses the body and then lowers your ability to move freely. And that's where you start to run into this degradation of connective tissue. So just keep that in mind. There is compression, but the compression happens from a loss of tension by its integrity. So it was a long one, but this leads to the three most common knee injuries. We have patellar tendonitis, arthritis, and ligament or meniscus tears. And so now that we've set the foundation, these things should make a lot more sense. Patellar tendonitis is essentially the fascial sleeve that is stiffening around the knee. So what you want to think about is there are 4 quadricep muscles, 5 adductor muscles. You got your glute running in TFL running down through the IT band on the outside. You've got 3, technically 4 different muscle bellies of the hamstrings. You've got 3 or 4 calf muscles if you consider the plantaris. You got your tibialis. You got your muscles on the shin, the fibularis muscles. You have a lot of tissue. And that's not even including things like the sartorius, which runs down the front, the gracilis, those other small kind of like weird hip muscles that connect through the body. Those all factor into the sleeve that is your fascial tissue surrounding the knee. And so it's not just that you have a muscle that connects to a tendon at the knee, that's part of it, but that tendon is continuous with the next muscle all in the chain, and it's all wrapped in fascial tissue because it's all wrapped in skin. So you can think of just like your skin is part of the sleeve that wraps around your knee. Underneath that skin, you have several, I think 7 dermal layers. Underneath that, you have layers of superficial fascia. That's where you hold superficial fat, so to speak, or sorry, subcutaneous body fat. It's all the subcutaneous body fat is pocketed inside the superficial fascia. And so all of that wraps around and creates this compression. Not to mention you have a synovial joint. So it's a sac of fluid that kind of surrounds the knee and keeps everything in there. So you have a lot of stuff going on that is redundant. That creates that is the thing that is, you're not going to really get in and, there are something you can change and remodel to a certain degree the flexibility of things like your ligaments, but in general, those aren't going to be load bearing tissues. So in response to movement, they will stiffen and they will become more pliable. So you can develop more pliability in the knee, which we'll come back to later. But that's not your primary mechanism. You have your sleeve, your compression sleeve, if you've ever worn a sleeve around your knee, that is dynamically responding. And so when we don't get movement, it stiffens. Now, this creates compression to the joint. And more to that, when we don't get movement to this tissue, not only does it stiffen, but it also loses the hyaluronic acid that is dispersed between the layers of the tissue that allows the layers to glide and slide. So when things stop getting slippery, they start getting stuck. And what you can imagine this as is like a dilapidated rubber band that as it starts to wear out and get older, it starts to fray and pull apart. That fraying, that tearing, which is the painful stimulus, which is why when you wake up, you feel like creaking in the knee. Oh, hear that creaking? That's literally tissue creaking past each other, like trees rubbing against one another. But in this thing, you have tissue that should be nice and fluid and moist is not, and it's stuck. And that stickiness creates irritations and slight tears that then create a heightened inflammation. Not really, there's differences of whether or not it's inflammation, and people will play around with semantic words of tendinopathy, tendinosis, tendinitis, like whatever. The point is that you have a stiffness here that creates a signal that we need more stiffening. And so what you get in response to this is a hardening of you have tears and think about like a donut. The donut hole doesn't necessarily fill in this. So when you have tears and irritations and degradations, the donut hole doesn't fill in, the donut gets thicker. So the parts of the connective tissue that are wrapping around and connecting to the tendons, the fascial tissue that surrounds it, and the fascial tissue that runs and threads through the muscle, and just your superficial fascia around it, that starts to thicken and stiffen to make up for the fact that there are other areas that aren't, like when you start to get a hole. So imagine you put your fingers together, you link them together, and you start to pull them apart, but you can start to see some of those little holes. Those holes in some capacity still remain, but the finger, imagine your fingers getting stiffer and stiffer. And so that creates a snowball loop where not only is the fascial sleeve stiffening, it's also densifying. And so that creates in a non-pliable, non-productive way that creates a stiffer, less resilient joint. And so this is where you see people that after years and years of this, well, and this is where they end up with arthritis, but it's as though their knee just is made out of a different set of tissue. If you look at a kid who's so bendy that it's almost like they have no, they're little Gumby kids, versus, a healthy, athletic person in their 20s, their knee can bend, and you just see people that can bounce, and they're fluid, they're elastic, their knee can bend and rotate and move, and it just seems like the tissue is made out of different stuff. And that's because eventually it does become different things. We're eventually either working towards pliable, flexible fascia or hardened, stiffened bone. And so there's a calcification that happens. And so you can end up in a situation without movement that you have a hardened sleeve that calcifies around the joint. This is is part of the ultimate result that creates arthritis. Now, arthritis is bone on bone contact, but the important thing is to remember that bones are not supposed to be touching. They're held with enough space. And so that is a careful relationship between the stiffness of the ligaments. One of the things that Stephen Levine, who is the guy who termed biotensegrity, found is that when he would tighten knee ligaments, the bones would move further away. So you start to see a relationship between the ligaments and the bones that is buffered by its soft tissue and connective tissue, but it's not as though it's not as though the cartilage is just like pressed in and you're riding on each other. There's space in the joint, and that space is filled and held and supported by muscles and connective tissue and fascia. And that this holds the bones in this relationship that doesn't smash the tissue. So the long-term outcome of compression is this arthritis, which eventually is the bone-on-bone contact that creates an abrasive force that degrades the tissue. So your cure, and this is the important thing, is like whether or not arthritis exists is like saying, oh, there's mold on the wall. It's like, okay, yes, I understand that's there, but like, is there water damage? Is there something else? So you can acknowledge that there is bone degradation, and people say, well, you can't cure arthritis. Well, to a degree, there's an argument of how fast and how thoroughly connective tissue will heal. We know that it heals better in distal joints, meaning ankles and wrist, than just say shoulders and hips. But a good portion of that is, are they getting more range of motion and getting more movement? And so it's not that the healing factors are different at the ankle versus the hip, it's the movement capacity. So, the tissue is still tissue, and it doesn't just heal better because it's further away from the body. But there's a higher likelihood that the stress and the range of motion you're getting that continues to stimulate healing is greater at the ankle than it is at the hip, given most people's movement capacity. So there's a few things to understand, but the way to cure arthritis is not necessarily to focus on the tissue that's been degraded, is to remove the pressure in the first place. So it is tough because once you have a heightened sensitivity to that, you have damage at the tissue. That to a degree, that connective tissue and the cartilage will recover and heal, but only if you give it space to recover. So this is when people will take like BPC 157 and different peptides and PRP and all this stuff. And it's like, that stuff is great. But if you haven't removed the source of the compression and you haven't stopped bracing or debrading the tissue because your movement is poor, your strength is, you don't have any muscle capacity, and the joints are just sitting on top of one another, the joint will never heal. And it's like saying you have a big scab on your elbow, and I can give you some peptides and things that'll help increase the healing factor, but you won't stop picking the scab. That's the issue. And so what you see is it's very difficult to separate the person with arthritis from their habits, their actions, their movements, and their overall tissue. The tissue is just tissue. It's not like some bodies are just broken. It's all bodies are tissue that respond to stress. And the question is not, can you heal arthritis? It's, can you change the movement patterns that are leading to the compression that's causing the bone-on-bone contact? That's challenging. So you just have to remember those things when you hear this stuff, because it's like, oh, arthritis can't be fixed. It's like, well, you got to show me the person. We have to be able to work through this stuff. And then there's more nuance to the conversation than just, you're more than your diagnosis, so to speak. And then finally, we have our ligament and meniscus tears. So The important thing is to understand that these are not entirely preventable. And this, as much as people talk about bulletproofing joints and bulletproofing knees and stuff like that, if I shot you with a bullet, it's going to go through. If I hit you with a car, it's going to break something. So, there's a difference between training, and training and can improve the elasticity and the capacity and the resiliency and the muscle connection that will take what could be an ACL tear or meniscus injury and turn it into just a mild sprain or a little bruise. That's a huge difference. So that's the point of injury prevention, so to speak, is it just downgrades the severity of any contact. But what you have to realize too is compressed joints have less mobility. So if I have generally people have, ACL tears and stuff, there's not always, but usually one, and we'll talk about this in the stiffness and laxity or stiffness and mobility section, but it's not as though this came out of nowhere. Generally, you can feel, oh yeah, my knees, there's a lot of stiffness there. I had patella tendonitis for a while. I had this aching spot, or there's a lot of laxity, and I don't necessarily have any strength in the muscle. So you start to see warning signs on the front end that kind of lead you to this. And we'll talk about the surgeries and why you should look at that and things like that. We'll discuss that at the end. But let's see, there was one thing I was going to say there. It might come back to me. Ligament meniscus training improves. Yeah. So the point of the injury prevention is not necessarily to prevent it; it's to lessen that. And so we'll come back to this in the stiffness and the mobility section. But your knee responds to what you do and how you train it, and that's a big piece there. But yeah, I'll leave it at that. So when we're looking at this connective tissue, if we're understanding that the pressure is a problem, then we want to think, well, how do we address this? So this is the point of short and long range training. So this is a dichotomy based off of the fact that you have the thing you can consciously control is your musculature, meaning you can't consciously digest your food or squeeze diet or squeeze insulin out of your pancreas. You can't, you can use muscles to pull your lungs open and breathe air in, but you can't force air to come in. You can't force gas to exchange. So most of our body, most of our existence just depends on chemistry and physics, which those are highly related. So the thing you can control is your conscious connection to your muscles. And so muscles exist. There's a spectrum of long and short, meaning short would be a maximally contracted, long would be naturally stretched. So there's a contraction and stretch. Now, when we stretch, we are working muscle at some level to a stretched out degree. So you're developing strength in that. But eventually you become less reliant on the muscle contractile force to squeeze and hold in, but you become more engaged with the connective tissue that is surrounding that. So basically, you can think of this short and long range training as short range exercises are muscle dominant. They're crampy. So if you flex your bicep as hard as you possibly could, you're going to feel some muscle cramping. Basically, this kind of uncomfortable, crampy sensation at the in range of that. And it's about developing a neuromuscular connection. So you're learning to neuro brain muscle connection. So the muscular parts of the connective tissue, so the contractile fibers, improving that. So much of the development of improvement, so much of the strength we develop at the beginning of our strength training is not necessarily actual densification of the tissue or hyperplasia or hypertrophy. It's actually just increasing the capacity with which we can communicate to that muscle. So, you know, every muscle is related to a fiber. There are neuromuscular joints. So you have a nerve. Big muscles with a lot of broad movements, like your quadriceps, have a single nerve. It's like an alpha motor neuron or something like that. There's a nerve that runs down and connects to a larger group of fibers relative to something like your eyeball, which has, a smaller number of fibers for each nerve alpha motor neuron. So in a sense, basically you have one nerve fiber to like 12 muscle fibers in the eye versus one nerve fiber to 1,000 muscle fibers in the leg. And so the more fine-tuned we can control this, muscles either contract 100% or 0%. But we can say I'm contract 60% of the time, works every time. 60% of the time, 60% of the muscles are contracting 100% in a medium mid-range contraction. But maximal contractions, 100% of your fibers are contracting 100%. Because it's either 60, let's say 30% of your fibers are contracting at full speed, and then 70% are not on at all. That's the way it is. So, but it's harder and harder it takes effort to contract more of your fibers together because that requires energy. And so we can do this in extreme circumstances where everything, you can literally rip your muscles off your bones, tendons off bones, so to speak, but that's dangerous and highly injury intensive or highly energy intensive. So the point of strength training and the point of the short range training is to improve the connection and improve the capacity with which we can safely contract more of our muscle fibers to get a result. So the more we can do that, we're also increasing the circulation. So we're shortening and pulling the connective tissue. We're starting to shorten that and so get the muscles to increase circulation, increase the neuromuscular control, and that makes it safer for the long range exercises. So this is connective tissue dominant. They're essentially loaded stretches. Now, what that means is you take a stretch and you add load to it. And that load is important because that puts consequence on the movement. And consequence is important because that reminds our body that we do deal with gravity. And so we have to organize our joints and our tissue in a way that makes sense. For example, I can move my shoulder in many ways, but I'm only strong enough to press heavily in a few of those. So you want to think about the fact that there is a rhyme and a reason. There is a symmetry to our body that is uh, that points to a fact that there's an organization for our tissue that makes sense. And so the loaded part puts consequence on movement, and that helps our fascial tissue condition along lines of stress. So it's one thing to have space and range of motion, be able to move. We want options because when I have very low light in my hand, I want to be able to move my arm in many different ways and have integrity in the joint that way. When I have a lot of load, then I want to be able to organize under that. So it's a pressure of using load to organize our tissue. And so the load guides you along a set of tissue reinforced but gravity directed movement patterns that then create the pressure and the stimuli that enforce how your body organizes. And so this is a big part of remodeling the tissue. So you want to think that I do the short range to contract and engage the muscle and the long range to pull it open. So slowly pulling, we're restoring the viscoelastic capacity of the tissue. Viscous meaning it's a property between a solid and a liquid, so there is a stretchiness to it. And elastic meaning it returns to its shape after deformation. So our goal is to stretch the tissue across multiple planes of motion and a full range of motion to restore the length of that while also then having the neuromuscular connection to have strength in the muscle. So those two work together, remodel the tissue. So that's what you want to think about is every joint in the body, I won't say every, but I would say the majority of joints in the body work in this. So when we're thinking about conscious movement, we're thinking about the big efferent muscles. So those are I think it's efferent and afferent, but efferent are the power muscles. So if you think about the quadriceps, the hamstrings, the adductors, the glutes, the calves, I'd say the intrinsic foot muscle to a degree because you're pushing. To a degree, you got your tibialis muscles, you got your pecs, your lats, your obliques, transverse abdominis, your biceps, triceps, rear delts. All of these things come into play, and so those are the things we can train, and that training creates, let's say, a relationship with the muscle that then we can then stretch and pull. So we're working back and forth. And so that's the point of strength training. And so in the pictures, if you're familiar with Tom Segura, he stopped by the gym. He's a comedian, but this is a cool picture of him on the sled. That's a good short range exercise. So you're pushing through and only in a concentric and you're squeezing, you're getting blood flow. Not the best one, but I think a better example of a short range would be like really flexing and contracting. So a bicep curl, a hamstring curl, a quadricep leg extension. Those are short, meaning that they're the muscle dominant. You're contracting the muscle at the end range of that motion. Then you have something like a reverse Nordic stretch I have on the left and the ATG split squat, where you're lengthening through the hip flexors and you're pushing the knee. So if you see the knee in the far right picture and even the left picture, the knee is being stretched to its full extension. And that's starting to pull and create a remodeling sensation and a lengthening sensation on that knee that reduces compression at that fascial tissue around the joint. So there are a bunch of examples of ways you can do this, but essentially, some of you might know Ben Patrick, and that was his translation of Charles Poliquin's short and long range version. He took that, put it at the knee, so you get sled extensions, and so it works phenomenally well. You take the knee, you stretch, you contract, you stretch, contract, stretch, contract, you remodel the tissue, get more blood flow, you get better muscle engagement to disperse force, and you go from that. So a quick summary of the short and long range is that short range training reconnects muscles that can disperse force effectively. Long range training remodels connective tissue to be pliable and elastic. The combination of both creates space for a joint to function correctly. Now, again, there's a skill movement and there's a movement pattern and a component, skill component to this stuff, and let's say a mobility aspect for the messiness of rotation that needs to be addressed there. But you have space in the joint, which is the most important part. This principle stays consistent as you increase intensity and load over time, meaning what you start off maybe just a little baby backward sleds push is and some regressed foot elevated, split squats or stretching at the knee, couch stretches, what have you. That scales all the way up to full reverse Nordics and max effort squats, so to speak, or sandbag carries, or you name it. So it's the same concept of increasing your muscle contraction and then increasing the range of motion that you, let's say, developing strength in the connective tissue. So I think that's a better way of thinking about it than just increasing range of motion, because we don't necessarily just want range of motion. We want range of motion within a connected, pliable set of fascial tissues. So long term, this scales to the highest level of training that allows for a dynamic joint. So what does that dynamic joint look like? So this is the difference between stiffness and mobility. Stiffness and mobility are the two ends of, let's say, a spectrum within which the knee can move. So um, we'll break this as a few things. If you want to be fast and explosive, you want a stiff knee. If you want to be a resilient mover, you want a mobile knee. So I put jujitsu up here. So these are, some of my favorite things. So I love getting on the field, playing sports, doing stuff dynamically, volleyball, tennis, you name it, but also just doing cone drills and just changing directions and stuff like that. So that's kind of in the middle of this thing. So that's where most people exist. But on one end, you have jujitsu, which is the, one passion of mine. But some of the positions you get into, some of the pressures you're in with your knees and bending and moving, and it would make any, you know, traditional physical therapist or orthopedic surgeon just nauseous because there's so much pressure. So, and okay, of course, there's a lot of guys who get knees messed up and they have knee problems, but you have to understand that people that do jujitsu, a lot of people catch the bug. And once they go through, like they get to the blue belt, purple belt and onwards, most of those people just love jujitsu and they start to do only that and nothing else. And so then it's really, you can't just look and say, oh, it's not, you can't blame the sport. Well, it's like the person doing it, it's like blaming a car for being crashed over and over again. So, well, it's a dangerous road. It's also the person who's driving it is texting. So like, just keep that in mind, is that they're not fully there. So you have to separate the sport from the person doing it to a degree. But the point is that the knee can handle a lot of dynamic mobility. It can bend, it can twist, and it can do a lot of stuff and still maintain its integrity. And on the other side, you have sprinting, which is one of my other favorite things, just really getting at that. When you hit the ground, you're driving fully into the ground with a very dynamic force. And that force is basically working through internal and external rotation where the foot punches the ground and pulls through. It's this dynamic punch, and you drive through as the entire leg rotates inward. There's very little movement at the knee. And if you look at people, especially when they get the top end sprinting, their knee is not bending very much, if at all, underneath them. When they step over and they glide over their center mass, the stronger you are, the less your knee bends. So if you look at people that are running and they're bending a lot, they're generally very weak in their body. They have little integrity, or they're wearing really silly shoes that are overly padded. And so, or like there's a level of, there's an integrity. This is, I shouldn't do this, but there's a quick summary. There's a relationship between the ground stiffness and your running form. So your form is maintained regardless of the surface. If it's a softer surface, your knee has to stiffen. If it's a harder surface, your knee can relax. And so you start to see this relationship between that. But there's a difference between when your knee is stiffening and versus relaxing. You're stiffening by increasing active resistance. So it takes more muscle effort at the knee to maintain the stiffness. When you're active effort, so you're on a harder surface, your muscles can relax, but that increases the passive stiffness, meaning you're driving more force to the connective tissue and your tendons and your fascial tissue. So that can put more wear because you're using less muscle to disperse force. If you're not actively, like, really overemphasizing your effort there, you kind of will passively get there and drive more force in the knee. That's why, it's quote unquote bad for your knees to run on hard surfaces. It's not at all. It's just if you don't have fascial integrity, then you end up putting more force into the passive tissue. So that's a different conversation. But the point is that the best training program is the one you're not doing. It's one of my favorite quotes. I heard it a while back, but it just pointed to the fact that, if all you do is sprint and you are, jumping and you're driving force on the ground, and let's just say you're, look at the guys that are the athletes that are explosive and powerful, they can sprint and run. They end up developing a stiff knee because just like the stiffness on a car, if you're going to go and drive off road and do a bunch of like, those Jeeps and stuff that drive off and have to do terrain and climb up mountains, they have really big shocks and they can really absorb force and kind of bounce around. But the sports cars that are on a racetrack that's flat, they have really stiff shocks. So it's the same exact correlation, because when you're driving through the ground, you have a lot of torque that passes through the knee. And if your knee has to bend and buckle, you lose that force. So I want to just be able to smash in the ground and just pass over that and move. But if that's all I do, then I end up getting too stiff of a knee to be able to handle any type of, like I sprain an ankle, it rolls over to the side. I can't handle any kind of, uh, let's say, uh, external force that shifts me in a different way, and I'm much more likely to have tears, pops, and big breaks. Whereas on the left side, if all I ever do is jujitsu, and there's a lot of guys that do this, I end up just a lot of guys. The joke is the guys that do jujitsu too long, they just get these skinny legs. You get these, and I see these guys that have the, like, really bumpy knees because they have a lot of old injuries and stuff like that. But it's like you don't have any muscle to disperse force. You can kind of be like noodle legs, and they can kind of whip in and whip around. There's a whole thing called rubber guard, for example. And so, if you want to be resilient, then they can move dynamically. You want mobile knees, but too much of that, and you lose the ability to really produce force, and then you start to put more pressure on this connective tissue, and that creates this kind of like, I don't say hypermobility per se, but it creates this weird relationship where you have a stiffening and you start to rely on passive connective tissue for your stability as opposed to any type of muscle to disperse force. And those guys lose the ability to be powerful and run and jump. And that's a problem. So the real question is, I mean, there are people on each extreme there are people who literally would sacrifice all the ligaments in their knees and all the muscle just to be good at jujitsu. And there are people on the opposite side that would sacrifice any amount of mobility just to be able to break that next 100-meter world record. So like there are nuts on either side. But the point is, for most people, meaning, and I think the healthy person has the ability to do athletic capacity, meaning they want to run, they want to sprint, they want to jump, they want to be able to change direction, they want to play sports, they want to hike, they want to walk, they want to be able to do yoga and get on the ground. That's a healthy, regular person. To people in the middle, what should they do? Well, you want to be in the middle of this bell curve. So it's not so stiff that you can't bend, but not so bendy that you can't get stiff. That's a big difference. So this kind of middle thing is, that stiffness works until you want to decelerate, and the deceleration works until you want to accelerate. So that's where you have to see this. So the thing to know is, like, your body will give you warning signs when you get too far to either side. Excessively stiff knees, you'll get tendonitis pain. So this is that stiffening and compressions. This is where you see a lot of people end up, and this is the precursor to big tears and nasty pops. So quadricep tendon pops and tears, ligament tears, ACL tears, meniscus things, because you just imagine that the stiff shock, there's a fragility, and you probably felt this. There's a fragility that happens if I, like, step on something that's uneven or change directions. Like, ooh, my ankle feels real stiff. I don't really like that. Or my knee, ooh, I don't like that. That creates this this stiffness that isn't resilient, and that's where you get the big dynamic blowouts, so to speak, is because you have something that just it can't bend because it's gotten too stiff. Then the other side, excessively mobile, you get pain in smaller stabilizers. So this will be like, um, let's just say maybe with the knee, you're looking at more like the IT band pain, it's kind of this weird like calf stiffness, but it's not necessarily like there are smaller muscles, so hamstring stiffness. It's not, it's not stiffness. I don't know the right word. It's generally going to be more like pain in the adductor, pain in the groin, pain in like the bursae, that are like, basically you get this inflammation, this swelling pockets, pain in the upper calf. So like the back of the knee. See, these things that aren't like major muscles, but they're like stabilized muscles around that. It's a little bit less easy to think about that at the knee because there's so many big muscles at the knee. But imagine at the shoulder, if you have loss of strength there, you get frozen shoulders, but you also get irritation of supraspinatus, subscapularis. And also, it's important to realize that these aren't mutually exclusive. All roads eventually lead to an ACL tear if you ignore things for long enough. But so like if you're too lax, you have no muscle, yeah, eventually you'll step. And this is you see this at a higher level with people that do, let's say, heightened grip sports, meaning especially when you're like skiing and snowboarding, your feet are strapped in. But if you look at cleats, especially on turf, any cleat increases the risk of injury. It doesn't matter what the cleat is, because the spikes are fixing you in the ground with a fixed foot plate that then creates extra torque at the ankle that just goes right to the knee. So that is there. Hiking, where the boot is coming up over the ankle and prevents movement there, that increases torque of the knee. Basketball or volleyball, where the foot, you get so much traction between the ground because of the grip on the court, that you can rotate and you can move, and that's directly correlated to the laxity of the joint. If you don't have any strength there, then eventually you'll have an issue, and if you have too much there, then you're going to have an injury. So it's a balance to find between those two things. But just the most important thing to take from this side is that the knee is dynamic. So that leads to the last piece here, which is surgeries, scans, and screens. You know what you should do. Obviously, I'm a doctor. I'm an orthopedic surgeon, and you should do everything I tell you to do, especially when it comes to women's health and nutrition and your spiritual sanity. Everything I ever say is truth. So listen to me and do everything I say blindly. Ultimately, it's up to you though. Like, that's the important thing to realize. Like, I have friends that have gotten ACL surgeries and have come back and been fine, and I have friends that have not and been fine and had bad knee injuries and moved on. So, you know, this is a nuanced part of this, and this is where there's not an answer, because the way I look at it is that incentives shift perspective. So if you went to school and learned an effective surgical technique for healing ACLs, and this is what you did, and you spent 20 years doing it, now you're an expert, you're a hammer that looks for nails. Can I actually trust you? And sometimes you can. There are great surgeons out there who be like, yeah, I don't think this is necessary. But it's really hard to go to the car salesman and believe them when they say that, yeah, you should really get this car. It's like, yeah, but I know that your paycheck is dependent on this. And so you have to realize that when orthopedic boards talk about the effectiveness of surgery, they're already going to be incentivized to think that surgery is going to be the best option. And when you get the natural healers, and let's say, people that are against any type of medical intervention, they're already going to be incentivized to think that, you can do everything on your own. So I don't have the answer, but I think that there's generally somewhere in the truth that is that it lies of whether or not you should get surgery. So the thing I'll talk about when it comes to surgery is that there is redundancy in the body. And so, you know, it's like thinking, if you look at the ACL, and we'll look at some pictures in a moment, it's a very small little stretch of tissue. That the forces on this thing, it's like the seatbelt in your car. If you're relying on the seatbelt, a lot of other stuff went wrong. And so, I think there's this, and this comes with the scan. And this is the idea of the pop can be many things. Like, I remember one time I was stretching, I was doing a standing table stretch, and basically you do a pigeon stretch, but your front leg is elevated, and I had it way up high, like hip height. So I'm standing, I'm leaning forward, and all of a sudden it's pop in my right knee, and I was like, that was weird. And there's about 2 weeks where it was sore, and I didn't have much range of motion in it. Maybe it's still a little stiff now. I don't know, but I didn't get a screen. I didn't get a scan. But do I have any type of complex around my knee is bad? I can't do this. It's like, no. So does that mean I strained something or did? I don't know. So you have to be careful what you look for. And again, that's not saying to be ignorant, put your head in the sand, but it's one of those things where, like, you know, for everybody, I think there's like 200,000 ACL surgeries every year, and how many meniscus surgeries and how many scans and screens. For every one of those, there's, I mean, you think about people in countries that don't have access to this to go get every single pop and crack and everything you cater towards. For every one of those, there's got to be 5, 10, 15, 20, 100 pops that didn't get looked at and were just fine. And so it's one of those things where it's hard to remember, but there was a long time where we existed without surgery. And so again, I know that this can be a redundant Luddite argument of like, oh, technology bad, surgery bad. It's like, no, I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that the body has a tremendous redundancy built in, whether it's layers of fascial connective tissue, layers of other ligaments, muscles. There's so many muscles that wrap around and connect at the knee. There's so much redundancy built in the body that it's like, to think that, you know, we are surviving from the ancestors of people who lived in much harder times, that, oh, we have one little bad knee thing, pop. Of course, the underlying argument, and this is what I said with Achilles tendonitis and Achilles tears, is that should not happen. So if you got to the point where you have a tear, some stuff went wrong. And it's not like your Achilles, this is the thing to remember. It's not that your Achilles is bad or your ACL is weak. It's like, no, your genetically reserved or preserved ACL and the Achilles and all these tissues are from people who for millions of years had to learn to walk and run and do all this stuff and could not risk getting injured because they got eaten. So the genetically weak models of this stuff, they're not there. That doesn't mean we can't be missing nutrients, we can't be missing movement, we can't be missing a general developmental stimulus that would otherwise keep us, help us to expand or like grow into a healthy set of tissues. Of course, that can be part of the tissue. So it's not saying it's purely one or the other, but it's just to remember that there is redundancy built in the body and we survive for a long way, and that our tissue isn't necessarily, it's not helpful to think of it as defunct, right? And also, if you look in some of the studies, and this is something I'm going to write this article and so do a little bit more research into this to bring some more numbers and stuff if I can, because people like numbers. But there's the whole category of people called copers, and so that's the official term that describes people who don't have an ACL but manage to cope and live. But AKA they're able to run and do sports and play and do certain things and not have pain. Basically, they're not impacted. It doesn't mean they don't have pain and do certain things, but what you look at, if you go and you look online, if you look at like a Reddit forum, which I like because, of course, there's a difference between, and you somewhat biased, but if I go read an article from the Orthopedic Board of Surgery about how ACL surgery is necessary, I'm like, all right, it says it in your name though. You're like Ford or, Honda telling me why I should buy an Accord. It's like, yeah, okay, but you already bought in on the idea that cars are necessary. So like, I'm just saying there's an incentive that does shift that. And so when you go to Reddit, you can read people's experience with this stuff. And I think it's interesting because you see a very broad array of stuff, but you realize that people are so different. I mean, so for example, on the right, this picture is my friend Jimmy House. And so this is like a year and a half ago or something. He got in this jujitsu injury and he had but he's got massive quads. And so he's a big boy, but he got a knee caught. And so he had like ACL, MCL tear, meniscus tear, fractured a bone or something. And he didn't need surgery. But then within the next year, he was back to doing jujitsu at full speed. He was front squatting 405 pounds. He was jumping and he went and did an entire wrestling. Like he's doing this WWE preparation because he wants to be a professional wrestler. And so that's a bunch of dives and jumps and sprints. And so crazy stuff. That was one of the things. But then eventually he had about a month or two ago, he had I don't know, a bucket handle tear on his meniscus. I don't know if it was a fully related the first time or whatever, but and then this is on the bottom. This is 2 weeks after that bucket tear, and then he's back pushing 715 pounds. I think he elected to get surgery on the bucket hair meniscus thing, but this is again, remember on the bottom, this is before he got that surgery, 2 weeks before surgery. So 2 weeks after the tear, we could hardly move. And so look, I'm not saying that there's one way, but he stands to me as an example of like, if he knows a lot about this stuff and can get after it, and he just spent time being a professional rehabber and he's got a great amount of knowledge. Okay. So does that mean that the knee is broken, or it just depends on who's using it and how well you get actual, approaches? So there's certain things like we know that partial ACL tears and partial strains can heal and can recover. And we know that cartilage can remodel. And we know that there's different processes. I saw one, there's a protocol where it's like a 12-week thing where they inject it with different stimuli. They fix your knee in a specific 90-degree angle, and then your ACL, full to ACL tear, can regrow. So there's a lot of magic that happens in the body. And so it's so hard to read people's interpretations, say, oh, I had this for a year and never did it. Well, maybe you don't know jack about getting a recovery. Maybe you don't. Maybe you go and you do some squats and you think that your PT is going and trusting your therapist for twice a week for a year. Oh, we're going to do this stuff. You never actually load it. You never get in the messiness of rotation. You never actually work on sprinting and jumping and plyometrics. You never work on like a full range of motion. You don't do any type of, pigeon raises, split squats, revert. You don't really pull and push on the tissue. And you just think that going to the gym doing leg presses and quad extensions is enough. That's not the same as somebody who really gets after and understands the dynamic nuances of all the different capacities. So the important thing is to not let someone else's lived experience dictate truth for you, because their experience might be true given the constraints that they put on their knee. And there could be someone who did every possible thing. Jimmy did a lot and he still had a recurring injury, but he had a tremendously horrible first knee injury. And so I know that this doesn't give an answer, but I just want to give nuance to this stuff, because you have to realize that surgery is not a guaranteed success. The only thing that's guaranteed is that the injury, it's going to force you to rest, and there's an 8 to 12 month long rehabilitation process that is 8 to 12 months of your life. That is whatever. And some people say, oh, you do it once and you're good to go. You have it. But how many people do you know that have an ACL tear once, twice, three times? It's like, it's not a guarantee that it'll never happen again. So that's the important thing to remember is that, you know, there isn't a guaranteed answer. I know that there are people, and I'm not saying surgery can't be valuable, and I'm not saying that their injuries aren't bad enough that it's worthwhile. Like if I get shot in my liver, I'm going to want the bullet removed. So, there's a bunch of different things that are going on. My liver can regrow, which is a cool thing too. But the body generally has a lot more magic than we give it credit for. And so it's important to understand that, like, the question on doing surgery isn't just, well, am I willing to do the physical therapy? Because if you get surgery, guess what? There's a heightened increase in osteoarthritis within 10 years after getting ACL surgery. They don't want to tell you that, but it's a big thing. And people who have it almost consistently, let's say, I don't know if it's 100%, but it's a very high percentage of people who in their surgical knee have a heightened incidence of osteoarthritis. And you know that it's not quote unquote genetic because the non-operative knee doesn't have that. And so, you know, just because you get surgery doesn't mean you're not robbing Peter to pay Paul. And just because but the same thing could be said too. The person who gets surgery and just thinks that doing some leg presses are going to be good enough. Did they ever return to their sport? Did they ever really take their movement seriously? Did they work on all these pieces? I don't know. So I'm not going to say that surgery, like, you can ask the same question. The person who didn't get surgery and didn't do anything, of course, they're going to have problems. The person who didn't get surgery and did everything perfectly and heals to an incredible degree that they're no longer affected, very possible too. The person who got surgery and didn't do anything and still has problems, yeah, and they tore it again, of course. The person who got surgery did everything perfectly and has great recovery, even better. Like theoretically, if you can get in there and do this stuff, we know how the osteoarthritis works. We know the degradation of this stuff. It's just a question of once you have, hey, Roy, no, he's scooting his butt on the floor. Don't even think about that. Dogs scoot their butt. I don't want your butthole juice on my floor. Um, Anyways, people who don't get surgery or do get surgery, ideally, if you can go in there and have a reconstructed thing and it doesn't cause too much damage to the tissue, and you can go in and actually work on that. But you got to remember that when you go in, you cut things, cut muscles, and pull things apart, that creates a painful stimulus on the knee. And getting back to that means you have to actively engage those muscles again. There's a lot that goes into that. So it's not as simple as saying, hopefully it works. You have to be able to take ownership of this stuff. And that's the hard part is injuries force you to really lean in and look at your knee. So, yeah. Oh, and the last thing, and this is literally the last part of it. I just wanted to open up this thing just to show some examples, this pictures of this stuff. I just thought this was cool. I was gonna take one, but then I was like, oh, there's so many. All right, so just as we scroll through this, I just want you to start to see the white stuff is tendons and connective tissue, and then red stuff is muscles, and then you get the blue stuff, which is cartilage. And what this doesn't show is the fascial encasement. So this is wrapped up in a lot more stuff. But lateral knee, you have these muscles. This is the top where you're looking down, the meniscus here, and the cup and the cartilage tissue connected the labrum right there. You have these larger components of ligaments on the outside. You have on the medial part of this, so these are all the calf muscles coming up, the hamstring tendons coming in, the quadricep tendons going over the top, all these different small pieces. You have on this medial aspect, this is the lateral aspect of the knee, I think. Yeah, so the semitendinosus and semimembranosus on the inside, between them have 11 tendon insertions on the inside of the knee. So these are like these tendons, like little fingers grabbing the inside of your knee. And so what I loved, the picture I loved the most was somewhere in here. Oh yeah, this starts to show a bunch of the stuff. Like there is so much redundancy, so many things built in here. And you're going to look and say that all of this stuff is contingent on one tiny little tissue. Let's say if this breaks, yes, of course the ACL is a big piece and it kind of creates stability in the joint, but there's so like all this is one little piece of tissue there compared to let's see, there was it. Compared to this huge amount of redundancy that's built in with ligaments, muscles, they go in a fascial sheath that are then, as you get in there, layers and layers of connective tissue that are wrapped around by all of these tendons. I mean, there's so much that goes into the knee that is underappreciated when you look at actually how the thing functions. Just keep that in mind. When you look at the knee, if you train it well, the thing can be dynamic and it's worthwhile working at it. And if you have injuries, just there's more to it than just I got hurt.